Throughout his life, the wheelchair was never a thing I resented. It was an enabling piece of equipment that made our lives possible and his best life possible, so I was all happy with it. And I found myself after he died, like, I didn't want to look at that thing. It was a triggering, problematic thing. So to even deal with, you don't want to throw it away, it's valuable. Somebody needs it. Dealing with where to put it. And then finally I thought about you and called you and you said, yeah, we'll take it.
We'll take it. Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. I am very excited to be here today, but before we get started, I feel like I should give a little bit of a warning to the audience and to you, Daniel. My voice is really a little off today. I just sound a little bit wonky, so I just want to let everyone know. So I apologize in advance if you can't understand everything I'm saying. But I'm sitting here with Daniel Defabio, and there's this great story about how we've reconnected, I should say. We have known each other through the work of Jake's Help from Heaven, but most recently I was reading a book by a mutual friend and a previous guest on A Place of Yes, Jessica Fine, and in her book, Breathtaking, all of a sudden she's talking about Daniel Defabio. And in my head, I was like, it's not like a John Smith name. It stands out a little. And I was like, could it be? Could it be the same? So I reached out and in fact was the same. So I love the way our worlds intersect and the way that the rare disease, the grief world, all of that is becoming so much smaller. So before we get into all of those things we could talk about, I want to give you a more formal introduction. You are the Director of Community Engagement at Global Genes.
Right.
And you are the co-founder of the Disorder Channel. And you are very involved with the Rare Disease Film Festival, potentially even the founder.
Yes, co-founder. Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, it was all an outgrowth. Having a child with complex medical needs will change your life. And eventually I felt the need to talk about it or write about it. So it was a blog post first. And when that sort of landed with some people, that it wasn't just me venting, I realized it might do some good in the world. Then I thought I had a background in film, so maybe I should make a film. And so I made the documentary about Menkes disease. And like you said, these communities are so small. My son had Menkes disease. Who else was going to do it? There's about 100 people in the world that are dealing with Menkes disease. And what's the overlap of people with film skills plus Menkes disease? So it really had to be me. And then having made that, what do you do with it? So eventually it did some film festivals and it did some medical conferences. And then I thought I had previously created the Boston Spa Film Festival. I said I could create a film festival about rare diseases. And with Bo Bigelow, that's what we did. And we did it in Boston. That's where we met Jesse Fine. And then 2 years later, we did it in San Francisco. And then we thought we'd do it in New York City in 2020 in May.
Yeah, not going to happen.
It was the worst time to gather
timing.
Vulnerable medical populations into a movie theater in the middle of COVID. It was terrible.
In Manhattan, yeah.
But that led to what could we do instead, which the instead was you could have a virtual film festival, but we didn't quite like that idea. So we had a streaming channel, which is the Disorder Channel, and it's available on Amazon Fire TV devices.
So let's go back to how we met. That's kind of the root of the rest of our conversation. So talk to me about your son, Lucas.
Yeah, he was our first child, and right off the bat, there was something wrong, but not unusual, super unusual, but it was a fracture at the occipital base of the skull. And so they're very nervous. Is their brain bleeding, whatever? So we were in NICU with him for the first 10 days. This will be relevant to the Jake story too. We needed to stay at the Ronald McDonald House down at Albany Med. So our world is changing, and we...
Overnight.
Yeah. And we both, my wife and I, had, I guess, enough privilege in our life that we never needed any charity. And here we are like, can you take us into your inn at Christmas time? He's born December 21st.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize.
So we spent Christmas at the Ronald McDonald House, which I went into thinking it's going to be the most depressing thing in the world. And it was actually the most joyous, uplifting, amazing.
The work they do is unreal.
Life affirming. It was amazing. Eventually, everybody checks out Lucas to their satisfaction, including neurology. And they say, he'll heal. We can't explain it. It's a strange fracture, but he seems to be okay, stabilizing. You think you're on your path to normal child rearing. And with the first child, you don't actually know anything. It took a while until age 9 months. We saw little bits of missing milestones. And we thought, well, maybe this is because he's still healing from the fracture. Or he was 2 weeks early. Maybe it's about that. And then at 9 months, he not only wasn't keeping up to milestones, but he regressed. And somebody said, you need to go see a geneticist. And luckily, here in small-ish Albany, New York, the geneticist had actually seen somebody with Menkes syndrome before.
Okay, so I didn't know that you were still in Albany I was wondering if you had made it to Boston or something. Okay, so Albany, and they diagnosed him.
Yeah, so he had actually had 2 other patients. I got to know those families because It's a small world. If it had not been for that, he might not have known how to diagnose lupus. But so you've probably heard enough stories now. People go, well, your own story. You go on these really long diagnostic journeys sometimes, and it takes forever to get an answer if you do. Usually 7 years is typical. In our case, it was a few months. You don't want bad news, but I guess you'd rather want bad news faster than slower.
It's such an interesting thing, and it's something that I've talked about quite a bit because, I sit here and listen to you get a diagnosis that quick, and all of these years later, I'm still like,
You're
it's
jealous.
a weird thing. I am. I was just going to say it's a weird thing to say, but I'm jealous. Like, it's a name. When you talk about that journey, for those who don't know, at least with Jake, they were testing for all of these things, and some of these things were, there's one person in Asia that has something similar, so they're testing for things that they can count on one hand who has these diagnoses. And I remember Brian and I getting very frustrated, being like, what do you mean? Like, we're Boston Children's. How can you not figure out what's wrong with my kid? And I remember one doctor, and I've said this before, but they were like, sometimes it's better to not know than to know, because everything we're testing for, like, none of it's good news. And it was funny because at that time, it was like, okay, let me focus on something else. It made me not like perseverate so much on like, what's he have? What's he have? It never filled that hole, like still all these times. And it's always hard because people say, well, what's wrong with him? And I never could say it. To have a name of a disease, there is something kind of validating.
Yeah. And I would say those doctors are wrong. That's a very doctorly bias. If there's nothing we can do about it, why would you even want to know what it is? Well, here's why. Because I might start a foundation and I might go find the cure myself. And you can't do it until you get the genetic result or the name of the disease. And then you start to gather your people and figure out what are your steps forward. Other
people. That answer reminds me of a lot of another guest, but another Jake's family, Hillary, Esme's mom, finally got this diagnosis. Once they figured that out, it was really life-changing for them. And, she became involved in another foundation, and she found all these other kids and all these other families all over the world. And there was just something in that was such a big pivot. Menkes. I remember reading in something I think that you had written or that was written about you about how the first 10 days are pivotal and how frustrating that must be that the first 10 days of Lucas's life, he was in the hospital for something else and they didn't know.
So we were in the right place, the right time with all the right people looking at him. And in one sense, no doctor is going to know all the rare diseases. So what are the chances? But we were seen by neurology and they were probably best suited to know something like this. Unlike so many rare diseases where, as we just mentioned, the doctor will say, well, there's nothing we can do about this disease. There is something you can do about Menkes disease if you treat it in the first 10 days of life. And we missed that window. He was not diagnosed till a year later.
How frustrating.
And they still offered us the treatment as an experimental, compassionate use protocol thing. But maybe it did some good, but it didn't do the good we know it can do.
So what does it do? Is it a cure or is it a slowing?
It so dramatically reduces the symptoms that you might not notice them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
it's significant.
Kids without treatment, like Lucas, will not walk, talk, sit unassisted, eat unassisted, even communicate in other ways other than we could sort of gauge.
You can tell.
You can tell, yeah. With the treatment in time, you might walk with a slight change in your gait and you'll have some additional pains and things that other people don't have. But to the outsider, you watch them finish high school and play sports and have hobbies and talk to their friends. And, maybe they live a little shorter lifespan, but they live the pretty, I hate to use the word normal, but typical range of human experiences available to them.
How do you come to terms with that? It's got to be hard.
It is hard. We look at it as we did everything we could. Yeah. We did it when we could. When any of this grief stuff, when you're looking back, hopefully you don't have a lot of woulda, shoulda, couldas, regrets, because that comes from knowing what you know now and thinking you would have known it then, but you wouldn't have known it then.
And if you knew it then, you would have done it. 100%. And I do think that is a key part of the grief journey, right? Is that you have to come to terms with everything that happened. And I hate the whole it happens for a reason kind of BS out there, but there's an element of that you sort of have to feel okay that you did what you could with what you had at that time. If the me now was Jake's mom then, it would just be such a different world. But that's not the way the world works.
You probably feel like you did. I think I did gain some superpowers along the way. Wouldn't it have been nice to have them at the beginning, but that's not the way it works.
And I talk about this with a lot of families, right? Like that ability that you learn over time when you have a child with a real significant illness or these very rare diseases. You have to be their everything. You have to be their voice. You have to be their advocate. You have to not take no for an answer. You know what I mean? You have to really fight for them. At some point, I think it switches, and it certainly switched for me, where you figure out it's okay to question doctors. Yeah, they're doing the best you can, but hey, you just wanted to put my kid on the same medicine you already put him on and it didn't work then. It's not going to work now. Let's move on. That to me wasn't natural. I learned that over time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the many sort of rude awakenings we have in this journey is that to the extent we could argue forever if our medical system works, but to the extent it works for the typical and the mainstream and the common. And then when we fall outside of those parameters, most doctors don't know what to do. And then we, who have been raised to think, well, you ask the doctor and they tell you. Or maybe you ask for a second opinion, but that might be rude.
Yeah, you don't want to hurt their feelings.
Right. Well, now
and what if they're mad at us? Then they won't take care of them at all. Yeah.
Yep. And now suddenly we're in the world of this doctor might admit it or might not admit they don't know. Yeah. And I not only need my second opinion, but third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and all of them might not know. Yeah. And then finally they say, oh, there's a doctor in Helsinki that might have studied something like this once.
And you're like, what am I doing?
So yeah, you do have to reset your expectations of the whole medical system because it's not built for us.
It's not. It's absolutely true. One of the things you said made me think of a geneticist that we worked with at the end of Jake's life. So in the beginning, there was just, when he was first sick, he had his first seizure at 8 months. During that time is when, like Boston Children's, they were all trying to figure out what started it, what happened, how do you take a previously healthy 8-month-old and have this happen. Once we acclimated to his life, and we had kind of moved doctors over to like Mass General, we found this geneticist who was revolutionary, in my opinion. Her bedside manner was a little rough, but she also was committed. I do think if he didn't pass when he did, we would have ended up with a diagnosis because she was like a dog on a bone. She was just trying to figure it out. And the phone would ring sometimes like Sunday at 9 p.m. And she'd be like, I'm going to send you the script, get it to your doctor because I need this test done because I'm going to try and do this. And he had a few doctors like that who just were the exception to the rule.
Definitely. We ended up, one of our specialists was, of all the many symptoms affected by Menkes disease, this would have been like low on the list. But because he had the best bedside manner and he really engaged with us and cared about Lucas, he became our lead guy. And we're like, why is this guy? And trust me, just do what he says.
Yeah, just follow it. Yeah, we like him. I want to talk about one more thing. So our paths crossed, through Jake's Help from Heaven. How did you even find out about us? That's always one of my questions when I talk with families too.
It was our case manager for, you probably know better than I do what all the different agencies are named, but one of them that,
Well, they also bounce around so
much. They change all the time too, So we were up against a couple of medical expenses and I think the bed was the first one, right? Yep. And the bed was a ridiculous example of how the system doesn't work, right?
Not work.
Medical equipment is so expensive, and if it's specialized, it's even worse. And so I think what happened, we qualified for a more advanced bed, a hospital bed in the home, and they would have paid for that. But it was too bulky and big for our lives, and we said, well, there's a smaller model, and that's what we want. And they're like, well, we won't pay for it. And then the caseworker said, Jake's Help from Heaven might handle that for you. And you did, and it was amazing. And following up on the Ronald McDonald House story, it was this weird adjustment in our lives of we are the ones who need charity. And we did. And you did it.
That whole idea of our healthcare system, the way that works to me is so outrageous, right? Like we will buy you this $12,000 bed, but we won't buy you a $4,000 bed. Or, and I'm kind of making up those numbers, but they're about where it is. And it makes no sense. There's countless stories like that.
Yeah. Another example like that, they would have paid, I think, $7,000 for the Dynavox communication device. But an iPad at the time was relatively new, but still would have done the same job for $700 and they wouldn't cover that.
They won't do that. No, they still don't. It's bizarre. It's 100% why we started the organization because once Jake passed, and you know this feeling, right? Like what are you going to do? You have something to do. You've got more time because your number one time, like Jake was 24/7 care. So it was just, there was no time other than taking care of him really. You have this time, but also, at least me, it's kind of become my life journey of just kind of keeping his memory alive and what can I do and how does my story help anyone else and how can we share? And we have this very small world that we're in. There's not a ton of people in this world and not necessarily like the lost world, but the sick kid world and trying to figure that out and trying to have a quote unquote normal life. When you have a child with significant needs, there is no end in sight of the costs. And it doesn't matter really if you make a good living or you don't, because it's just so different. And someone had said that to us when we first came home with Jake being really sick. And I was like, no, I'm not applying for any grants. I'm not doing that. Like, we're good. We don't need to. But they kind of made it so clear to us. And those examples are always the ones I go to, because it's not like you could go buy a bed for Lucas at Target or Walmart or Taft's Furniture or like whatever, right? Like you needed something specific. And then the people who are supposed to help you are just making it so hard. We know this world, like this is our people, this is our world. We're comfortable here. And how can we provide service to other people like us, other families like ours?
And then just a little context detail on the bed in particular for us. Lucas had a bedroom upstairs, but he was getting so big and he's got to be slung over your shoulder. And we're in an old Victorian house. You go up the narrow stairs to get upstairs and you hurt your back while you're getting him onto the bed. So we decided he needed a first floor bedroom, and that was the dining room. The dining room became his bedroom, and then you needed the hospital bed because it could raise and lower him, which would make it easier.
Which helps.
Yeah. When they asked us, like, what qualifications do you need in your nurse? And I'm like, if she can lift 40 pounds, we're good. Over the years, he's not 40 pounds anymore, and she's struggling. She's hurting her shoulders and stuff.
And then I was trying to think if we did anything else with you guys.
So Lucas died, and it was COVID time, 2020. June of 2020. Among your many to-dos is, what can we repurpose here?
Yes.
What can we give equipment away? And you guys do that kind of thing.
Yep.
But nobody would take his wheelchair. It was so frustrating to me for a while. It was in our back shed and out of sight, out of mind. But throughout his life, the wheelchair was never a thing I resented. It was an enabling piece of equipment that made our lives possible and his best life possible. So I was all happy with it. And I found myself after he died, like I didn't want to look at that thing. It was a triggering, problematic thing. So to even deal with, you don't want to throw it away. It's valuable. Somebody needs it. Dealing with where to put it. And then finally I thought about you and called you and you said, yeah, we'll take it.
We'll take it.
And that was just such a relief to know that probably it went to somebody.
It's the exact reason why we have that equipment exchange program, 100%. When Jake passed, we had a lot of stuff. It's funny what you said about the wheelchair because we never thought of the wheelchair as like a confining thing either. And honestly, one of our first guests talked about her daughter, Cece, in her wheelchair. And she's like, people say it's so confining. She's like, no, this wheelchair gives her freedom. Like this wheelchair gives her the ability to see things that otherwise she couldn't. And that's kind of how we always thought about it too. We thought about these various things as just vehicles in which we could transport him and take him to see everything so that he wasn't just stuck. But we had all this equipment, and some things I could keep in my house. Like some things I still have in my house because the memories are pure joy. Other things I couldn't look at. I just couldn't. Like his stander, I couldn't look at it. Like I could not have it in my house at all. Like it just made me sad. So that's basically when we started the equipment exchange, because some stuff I could get rid of. Like one of his chairs I donated to Prospect. It's often a service when we lose someone, we always say, like in our Jake's family, that it's something like that we can do to kind of, for that exact reason. When Lucas passed, did you know it was coming?
So in one sense, we knew it was coming for 10 years because they tell you there's a prognosis here of 3 to 10 years and how much of an outlier are you going to be?
Yeah.
But we did know that he had his symptoms compared to other boys that it's almost always boys that have Menkes. And compared to the other ones we'd met, he seemed to have milder symptoms in some ways. When he did die at 11 and a half, I suppose he beat the odds, right? So we got a little extra time with him. But how it more immediately played out was that December, we were in the hospital with him, and the same specialist that we tended to like the most said the hard conversation. He said, you're probably looking at months, not years. You think to yourself, how many months? But despite all the rational information you have, if you're at all optimistic, you go, well, 9 months, 10, 11, 12 months.
I like that better than 2.
Yeah, it wouldn't be 12 months because you would have said a year.
A year.
So
you're at 11.
Yeah, so 11 would be, right. What do you know? It was 6 months after he told us that. And so that's right down the middle of months, not years. So we had that warning, but it didn't matter. You don't believe the warning, really. The illness that brought him into the hospital for the last time didn't necessarily feel worse than all the other illnesses. Every time you're wondering, are we going to make it out of the hospital? All the other times you did. Fighting to get out of the hospital. We'll prove that we're good enough and we're going to go home. Yep. And then you feel a little foolish if you're wrong. And the last time we were wrong.
But it's so hard because you do want to get out of the hospital. There's disease in the hospital. There's germs in the hospital. There's all of that. And sometimes we would find you get into this cycle. And one of the reasons we eventually made the switch from like Boston Children's to Mass General, but we ended up, as we slowly moved to Mass General, they had a little bit of like a different philosophy. At least back then they did. So like Jake had to have like double hip surgery. And at Boston Children's, if he had done it there, he would not have been able to have been discharged. It would have been like 10 to 12 days afterwards because he would have to have met all of these milestones. And some of those things, I was like, it is going to take Jake a very long time to get to any of those. Whereas at Mass General, they sort of saw that, and they saw Brian and I were somewhat capable of being able to take care of him. And if we could get him out of there, like I was like, I'll come back every 3 days if you want to check on him. Like we can figure that out. Having this like arbitrary checklist of things he's going to have to do before we can go home means we're going to be here forever.
Yeah, it was way late in the game when I got smart enough to like keep baseline records and say, yeah, his oxygen's low, but his oxygen's always low.
Well, exactly,
So,
those type of
like,
things.
let's talk about his normal,
Yeah.
not your normal.
Not your little checklist,
Yeah.
because your checklist, like, we might as well just move in. Like, we're all,
Yep.
you got the whole Strotter family now. Yeah.
You learn that one the hard way.
Yeah.
Every time it was like, we'd let you go home, but his oxygen's not high enough.
You know, I used to talk about the loss of your child, right? Like, and I used to believe very strongly there was like a hierarchy of grief, and that our grief was the worst. And there is part of me that still feels that way. There's also part of me that has evolved a little bit and recognizes all these different kinds of grief, right? And all of these different losses. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about, and I talked about with Jessica, and I've actually talked about with a couple other guests, is this whole concept of ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief. They're obviously not new, but they're relatively new to me. And it's a little bit like when we talked about like when you have a name for something, it validates it. I do find so much good out of these kind of terms because grief in itself is lonely, I think. You don't want to make people upset, so you don't want to talk about it. But if we don't talk about it, then people are always going to be uncomfortable about it. And not that it's our job to make people comfortable, but we're better when we share, I think. And everybody experiences grief. Not everyone experiences the loss of a child, but everybody experiences grief of some sort.
Very similar to when you don't have the disease name to research or to find the support for. That's for your person, your patient, your son, child. But for you, you also need a name for it, and it's grief. And you might not know it's grief, especially if there's no diagnosis, prognosis that says death is imminent. Yeah. You might not know ambiguous or anticipatory grief are things. And when I were at a local support group and somebody said, well, what this is grief. And I went, oh. Well, now I know what to call it. Now I know what books to read. Now I know what research to do.
Like a chapter. Yeah. Like a.
Yeah. And you're right. There's so many subtypes, and there's compound grief, and they're all useful distinctions because outside of this circle of awareness would get what's wrong with you, the parents. If the child's not dying, you can't be grieving. Yeah. But that's not true.
It makes it less isolating, right? In the beginning, I was like, well, I can only connect to people who've had this huge loss that I've had. But the fact is, no, you can connect with anybody over loss. The ambiguous grief, to me, is so impactful in terms of connecting with other people. You know, I remember early on, someone was like, well, you have to grieve the child you thought you were going to have. And my immediate response was kind of angry because I was like, no, like, Jake's enough. Like, I'm okay with the fact that this is not. But I wasn't. You know, I had a life that I thought, you know, especially he was my second. And, you know, you referenced earlier, like when you have your first kid, you don't know what you're doing. We did it once, we could do it again. To lose that, you know, there was grief there.
Yeah, and when you say the life you thought you would have with your child, you forget how much of that you're taking for granted. Oh, of course he'll go to school. Of course he'll graduate. Of course he'll go to prom. Of course he'll get a job. And all those of courses start getting crossed off the list.
And that realization that it's not just delayed, it's just not going to happen.
Right, right. To get into the very subgenre of grief, compound grief, we were told Lucas would never talk. Well, you wrap your head around that eventually and you maybe make your peace with it. But then he goes to a special needs school program and they're trying to do different communication techniques. And those aren't really happening. The eye gaze and the PEX cards and those things. And so you just get this next blow and this next blow and like, not that either, not that either. It's terrible to say because despite all that, there's still joys. You know, there's still good things. You had to let go of those expectations to
get to the joy.
Exactly. Yep. You can't appreciate the joys if you're hung up on what you wanted 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
That is, I mean, you almost gave me chills with that because it's so easy to get in that, like, what they can't do or what they won't do.
Yeah, and again, if you didn't let go of the previous expectation, then everything's a comparison. Yep. Like, oh, my kid didn't write an award-winning poem. Yeah. So how am I going to appreciate the fact that he was able to scribble? Well, in Lucas's life, that day that he scribbled was a breakthrough landmark day.
Yeah.
You can see the joy on his face that he knows he's doing something cool.
And something that he hadn't done before.
Yeah.
So before we go on to like what you're doing with Global Genes and more specifically, and I love the story about Lucas that you just mentioned, scribbling. Tell me more about Lucas's like day to day and what life was like with him. And
Yeah, it was interesting. One of those expectations that I couldn't get my head around was in the first 2 years, we'd take him to my mom's and she'd be daycare until he was ready for school. But we didn't know if he would be ready for school. And on my route home from my mom's to my house, I'm stuck behind a school bus. And it was a nightmare because every stop I'm looking at cute little kids getting on a bus and I'm thinking he's never going to get on a bus. And then, age 5, what do you know? Surprise, there's a special short bus that pulls up and it's got the lift in the back and we roll his wheelchair in and he does go to school. And this is one of my favorite stories. It's not true, but it happened. It's just, all right, so the kid, Lucas gets on the bus and a kid yells, "Luke, he's here and he brought popcorn." Now, the part that's not true is Lucas did not bring popcorn. I don't know why the kid said it, but what mattered to me was that someone valued Lucas as a friend and a schoolmate and all that context, And that broke my heart wide open. We hear back from school. They tell us his progress and stuff. And we always wondered, are they kind of overestimating him? We don't see that at home. How are they getting all these great results at school? There's a toy. If you had a big enough switch, he could hit a big switch, but not a little switch. So he could activate this toy that would shoot out across the floor. I think it was an alligator. And he'd lie in wait. Obviously, the teacher has to help him. But he'd wait for other friends to walk by or teachers to walk by, and he'd launch the alligator at him, and he'd crack up.
That's awesome.
Like a little devil. And we knew that mischievous nature because at home, if you bumped your head on a cabinet or hit your thumb with a hammer, he'd laugh his head off.
Crack up.
Yeah. And that actually kind of helped you realize, this is my hang up, not, I don't have to be that upset about the thumb.
Yeah, you're like, I'm okay.
But this other report came home from school that said, Lucas really comforted a friend today. And I thought, come on, what does that mean? You're overselling this. This isn't what happened. And then the other mom sent me the photo of what that moment was. And there's this boy, maybe seizing, but in distress and almost fetal position next to Lucas. And Lucas, who can barely control his limbs, holds that boy's hand. And he's smiling and proud of himself. And he's looking at his friend. And it's just... And then Becca is the mom, and she's amazing. When Lucas died, she sent me that photo on a rock with Friends written on it.
I saw
in the Friends logo font.
Oh, I love all of those stories. Like, that's the joy, right? Like, that is the moments when people don't know and they don't think that can happen, but that happens. You reminded me of Jake went to Prospect School and we brought him up, and I wheeled him in one morning. And this little boy, and he was like it was a special needs classroom, but it was a full range of sort of needs. But this little boy ran up and goes, "JJ's here." No one ever called him JJ. Like, I don't know, but like he was just legitimately excited. And the teacher was like, "JJ's his best friend." And I remember that feeling of like, Jakey's got a best friend. Like, it's just because those are things I didn't know to grieve, but there was like a hole in my heart, right? Like, my kid's never going to have a friend or he's not going to know. And then in their own way, they do.
Here's another. So we have a younger son, 2 years younger than Lucas. And just yesterday, for the first time, he started volunteering in that classroom. And the same boy, Hunter, is now 16. I don't know if my other son had much to do with Hunter, but he's in that room with Hunter.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and those windows into their school life, because you probably feel like you want to be there and you can't be there, and you got to trust that everything's going to go okay while they're there. And then another note we got home from school, it was written by a first grader, you could tell, in crayon and stuff, and it said, "No one is allowed to touch him or any part of him, even his hands, except Mrs. Green's class." And it's just so loaded, so many layers there. You're like, are a lot of people clamoring to touch Lucas? Is that what's going on?
Why is this sign necessary? What is happening?
How did we get here? That's what it was. Very territorial. Like, he's ours, which is wonderful, right?
Awesome. Very sweet. Yeah. It gives me such faith in humanity, where sometimes it's hard to have that. But these stories, right, of like the impact that our kids had just by being themselves, right, and the way that other kids are good.
Yeah, and I don't know if I chose to see more of it or we got lucky and we experienced more of it, but I think mostly we saw the best of people brought out. Yeah. We're walking along with a kid in a wheelchair that's obviously not as healthy as most, and the best of everybody came at us. And now I feel like without Lucas, I'm in this I'm back in the default world of like, how come that person on the street doesn't smile at me?
Yeah.
Why aren't they like fussing over my existence here? Oh, because I don't have the cute kid
Because I don't have
anymore.
the kid, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think that comes up a lot is, especially, or at least for me, 13 years out on this journey, right? I focus a lot on the good stories and stuff. I can sometimes bring myself right back to those feelings of not greatness, right? Of like anger and disappointment and rage even, right? Like those feelings of just why me? For me, a lot of that would wrap around this sort of like undiagnosis because I'm like a fixer, right? Like I want to be able to fix things and you're not letting me have the tools of which I can fix. And just anger, like, is it me or did you also have?
People like me with a few years of experience can do a disservice of talking from the vantage point of now, where you've learned a few things and you've dealt with a few and built up some coping mechanisms. That's not to say it was easy and it was never difficult. There were times when exhaustion was like the default state all the time. And we found, I think my wife too, we found ourselves at the breaking point. We could maintain there for a while, but one little thing would be the straw that breaks the camel's back and send you, stupid stuff like the basement flooded. Most people can handle that, but it might be the thing that puts us into a tailspin or the car got a flat tire. With every other problem.
When you're
you're
like
when
one
you're already,
step away all the time.
Yeah, you're already maxed out. Other things, I wrote a piece once called The Hazards of Happy Face Advocacy, because if you only tell the joys, then we're not learning. Or we're worse, we're alienating the one that is the parent who is struggling, and they think, sometimes I don't want to tell where I was not the best dad. And, one example, wearing these headphones is reminding me, I would find phases of Lucas where he was too loud and too complainy. And I thought, well, maybe I can just put on some headphones and sort of tune him out. Yeah. It wasn't tuning him out enough. And I was
like ready to lose.
I was on the edge. And there were times I'm like, I can't take this. On the other side of that is, what choice do you have?
Yeah. No matter how much sort of like work you do on it, some of those things still, they just show up. One of the other things that I would love to talk more about is your work with Global Genes. And were you involved prior to Lucas?
Yeah, I think probably like a lot of people, I didn't know what a rare disease was. I had no reason to seek out something like Global Genes until there was rare disease. I'm learning these new things. They're called rare diseases. What is that? And a friend of mine said, I have a friend who's working with this group that works with rare diseases. And I looked him up, and the group he was working with was Global Genes. I actually entered the first story I ever wrote about Lucas, which was called How Parenting a Dying Child Changed All My Expectations. It won a contest at Global Genes. And that was one of the things that made me think, maybe there's value in this. Maybe people are going to benefit from hearing these stories. And so that encouraged me to go to the Global Genes event. They do a big conference every September called the Patient Advocacy Summit. I went that year, and it opened my mind, because I had been doing what I called advocacy, was raising awareness, making some noise, figuring if people knew how bad this Menkes disease was, somebody would fix it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little naive, but that's step one, maybe. Yeah. That's probably step one. And then I get to Global Genes and I see all these real advocates that are seasoned and, they know what they're doing, and they're going in all these different directions. Some of them are funding research and making it happen and trying to get the cures, and some of them are only fundraising for other things, like what you do with the medical equipment. So all of a sudden my eyes were open to all these different paths and ways that you could be an advocate and you could, serve. And I met some amazing people, and Bo Bigelow was one of them. We founded the film festival together and the Disorder Channel together. And when Lucas died, it's terrible to look for the silver linings, but my schedule was different. I had been my own boss for a long time, most of my career. And that was great for being Lucas's caregiver, because you could move the schedule around however you needed to based on his schedule. And without the demands of being a caregiver for him, I could go work for somebody else on their schedule. And at the same time, this again was 2020, COVID, and a lot of people were thinking, is my work meaningful? And my work was making TV commercials. And I enjoyed it as fun, but it wasn't super meaningful. So I thought, this volunteer stuff I'm doing for Menkes and rare disease, that's meaningful. That's what I like.
And it has a different impact after.
Yes. Yeah. And then there's the legacy issue, right? Like, so much of it is that piece of your identity that was tied up in caregiver. And I don't know if everyone realizes soon enough, I didn't soon enough realize that caregiver is a separate and different job than parent.
Yeah.
And for a while, I kidded myself that they were the same. I'm just being his parent. That's what any parent would do. Anyway, without that taking up its demands in your time, I was able to approach Global Genes and say, do you need someone like me? It looks like you have an opening. And they're like, oh, you'd be great here. So I'm very glad it worked out. It's been about 3.5 years. And one of the things I get to do there is teach other people to tell their stories, their medical rare disease stories, among the people I met. So in that workshop, there'll be Mike Porath, a rare disease dad from the Mighty. And he was somebody, my first writing was on the Mighty.
On the Mighty. I follow them, yeah.
Yeah. And when I went to my first Global Genes event, I knew Mike by email, but I got to meet him face to face at Global Genes. And likewise, we have a contributor from the Every Life Foundation. I met some of those people at Global Genes, and Courageous Parents Network is another great resource where I, for a while, was a writer for them, and Jesse Fine's a writer for them too. I think sort of 3 powerhouses that I get to bring together to help people tell their stories next week. So I'm excited about that.
No, that's fantastic. This is the second time I'm using the word jealous within this conversation, but I love everything that you are talking about, all of these opportunities and places, because it has taken me a while. And I think mostly because once Jake passed, I threw myself into Jake's Help from Heaven. But I'm finding, like I wanted to start this podcast because I wanted to have these conversations. And I've been threatening to do some writing, but not really doing much of it. But I do feel there's so many stories to tell and that we have these stories. And I love that you're like knee deep in it. And I may be following up with you about how I can do it too. I was listening to you on a different podcast talking about storytelling, and I was like, this is, it's when you realize there's a whole world, like that you're not the only one thinking these things, that you have partners who are thinking and working the same things. And whether it's about grief or whether it's about sharing stories or whether it's about the rare diseases or the undiagnosed, our stories can help other people. And I do think it's important that they're told. And I love that you are telling them.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the advantages of going to the Global Genes event is, like I said, you get exposed to so many things. You get a crash course in not just the information that's being presented, but the people you're meeting. Yeah. And you're like, oh, this person's doing it this way, and this person's doing a podcast, and this person's doing a book. And then some of those things are right for you, and some of them are not. But if they're not, maybe you go, oh, this person's raising a lot of money. Maybe they can help me raise a lot of money. You find we always say you got to find your people, but first you almost have to know who your people are and which kind of people you want to find.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's great if somebody's bothered to collect them all into one place for you.
No, I think it's fantastic. I think that's great. How do you channel your grief into good?
They say the 6, that people talk about 5 stages of grief, but the 6th stage of grief is meaning or meaning making or purpose building. I've really latched onto that. I think that's what I need to do. Probably most people, whether they know it or not, they're trying to do it. Yeah, for now, it's certainly Global Genes work is part of it. Disorder Channel work is part of it. It's legacy, but it's also, if the voice of Lucas were to come to me and say, you've done enough, you can stop. I don't think I'd stop.
I don't think you'd stop, yeah. There is something really powerful, I think, about that sort of 6th stage of grief of like making meaning of stuff. Again, this is going to sound corny, but like I almost feel like it's become kind of like a calling, right? Like we have these experiences and these insights because of the path our life has been on. There's ways we can be of service to others. And I think we can be of service to others in ways when people desperately need them. I sometimes say that I want to do more and I do what I do because for me it is selfish because I just want to talk about Jake a lot of times. And I want to have these experiences where I can continue to have him be present and I can continue to be his mom. Whether it's working still in the foundation or this podcast or writing or sharing stories or any of these conversations, I feel like it's a really powerful way for us to still be Lucas's dad and Jake's mom. And not that that's why you do it, but it's because of them that we have the information that we have, right? And that we have the insights into this world.
People like us, I heard either you or one of your guests say, a lot of phrases we hear all the time, like don't sweat the small stuff and concentrate on the moment, and those life lessons, right, that we already all know. Yeah. But we are forced to live them.
Yes.
And it's not so much that like we're better people. Maybe we get to be better people. We get to be better focused or something like that.
Yeah, there's something
And then if the reason your Jake or my Lucas is no longer there, I don't think you want to revert to, I can shoot my selfies of my food on Instagram and try to find.
I'm not going to go backwards.
I'm not going to find meaning out of that. Yeah. Having lived this heightened sort of existential threat life.
Once you're there, it's like you can't retreat.
Yeah.
So you just have to go forward, and going forward is continuing in this work or in this.
And for some, I hope it's not me, but maybe some it's similar to being like an adrenaline junkie. Like I was operating at this level and I've got to stay at this level. I hope for me it's more I was shown what matters. I want to stay in what matters.
Yeah.
I don't want to go back to, do I have the best car on the street?
Yeah.
Or is my whatever vacation plan better than your vacation plan? I had a moment, I called it game over, very close to diagnosis day. It occurred, they're laying out the prognosis. And game over sounds terrible because it sounds like we're giving up, and I wasn't giving up. But I was realizing the game playing is over.
Yeah.
That whole, I'm a young man in my career and I'm going to chart my course and go on to greatness or whatever I'm going to do. Yeah. That's over because what's the worst thing that could happen to me? You could tell me my son's going to die. Well, you just did. If there's a game, I lost it or Lucas lost it or whatever.
However, both.
Yeah. So that's out the window. I mean, I don't wish it on anybody, but it's liberating in a way. It's certainly a sea change of your mindset. Yeah.
It's a massive shift. I love the person I have become because of Jake's illness, because of even Jake's death. And the flip side of that is I would give $1 zillion to be a less enlightened person and have my son back. You know what I mean? But since that's not real, it's powerful that we have had these opportunities to use what they've taught us and kind of tell their stories. So you referenced an article you wrote, and it got me thinking, how do you parent a dying child?
The biggest takeaways were mindset changes, right? So because the continuation of that title is changed all my expectations. Yeah. A lot of the wisdom of the ages, the rules of thumb or the passed down slogans we hear, like stay in the moment, don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff. Those things became very real. Instead of just like, oh, that's probably good advice. It was like, no, this is a survival guide. This is necessary. We're going to refocus along these lines. So that's a big part of it, like listening to that wisdom of the years that you probably ignored for a long time.
Well, you said something that I just think is so important, right? So yes, don't sweat the small stuff. And we all say it and we've all heard it a million times. But when your kid is sick, when your kid is dying, when that is happening, every single thing is small stuff. And I still, 13 years later, sometimes it might be me or it might be Brian or someone's getting super worked up over something, or none of it is that big of a deal. It does change your life a little bit to be able to step back.
And so those lessons were important for me to embrace and sort of cling to. Lucas was, in a way, our guide through it because he was so happy, usually. You take your average person, I don't know if they're 50% happy, 50% sad in their life, but Lucas was 80% of his time beaming with joy. That's awesome. And he's bright blue eyes and this big wide smile. And if he's like that and you're stressed out, you're thinking about his next appointment and his next possible symptoms. But he's like that. You can sometimes on your better days, you can kind of look at him, be at a little bit more peace. He's not worried. Maybe I could worry a little less. In a way, he
guided you.
Yeah, he guided us. How do you get through the difficulties with Lucas? With Lucas. Perspective and size and scale is part of perspective. And so to the extent I have advice for anybody who's going through a hard time, I usually say, go to the ocean or go to the mountaintop or go to something epic. Look at the stars. And I knew it worked for me. I didn't know why it worked. And then I started reading this book called Awe by Dr. Shelton, I think his name is. And he says awe is an emotion. I never would have thought awe is an emotion. But in terms of why it would benefit us to experience awe is that you look at the vastness of an ocean or mountain or stars in the sky starts to trigger in us an understanding of patterns and systems that are bigger than us. Okay. All of a sudden, that made a lot of sense. First of all, it brings your giant weight on your shoulders down to a speck in the cosmos, right? So that's good. It puts you into proportions. But then if you start to think about systems, what systems are out there, right? Forces of nature, things that are out of control. If it's out of your control, are you going to rail against it or just try to go with it? Yeah. And then other systems like the man-made systems, like the medical system that doesn't work all that well. And then, okay, well, maybe there's something there that I can actually address because
that's something I can, that's like a lane I can go into.
Yeah. So those were part of our adjusted mindset, coping skills.
It's interesting that you talk about the look at something epic because that's such a natural thing, I think, because when you are at the ocean, right, and you look at it, every time we're there, Brian and I are just one of us at one point, like whether you're watching a sunset or a sunrise or just looking, you're like, how can it be so big? You know what I mean? Like it is awe-inspiring. And it does make you realize that you're just this one very tiny piece of this whole huge world.
Part of the comfort for me was it's a genetic mutation that causes Menkes disease. Mutation right there, it's like a freak occurrence, and you can get into the statistics of how unusual and unlikely that is. Also, in our case, it was de novo, meaning nobody in our family had Menkes disease, so it wasn't inherited. That shouldn't matter, but it mattered to me.
A little guilt, or it takes
right.
A little,
well, especially for moms who are carriers and feel they pass something on. I know there's a special kind of guilt they shouldn't have, but they do.
No, but it's like this emotion that.
Yeah, but knowing that it was a complete random fluke, and it's the numbers. 1 in 10 people get a rare disease. And then I had to process that, and I thought, well, 1 in 10 people is us.
Yep.
Sometimes you're the one. In some ways, that took care of the why me questions.
So it's the portion of the show, Daniel, where if you have any questions, you can ask Heather anything.
I would like to know, was there a time you were misunderstood and very surprised? Like, how could you have not known what I'm saying or dealing with, or what was so obvious to you that was not obvious to your friend or family member or whatever?
I feel like my head's going like in many different directions. One of the things that was so clear to me in Jake's life, right, was that I was going to create this life to the best of our ability in which we would have, and I don't want to say normal, but I think for a while I wanted us just to be a normal family with a sick kid, if that makes sense. So we would do stuff, right? Like, and we didn't do crazy stuff because like the doctors advised that he should never be on a plane because he had liquid, or fluid on his brain. Like there was stuff, but he was pretty okay if we were in a 2 to 3 hour car ride. So we could go to the city, or we could go to Lake Placid, or we could go to Montreal, or we could go to Boston. Like we kind of had this like radius, and we just wanted to live this life, right? Like very desperately. And there were people very close to me that judged that. I think they just felt like we should stay home, or that we should, well, you have a sick kid, you shouldn't do that. And I remember feeling like, shut the F up. Like, like you're not in my shoes, so don't. And also just being like, I would never tell anybody how to raise their other kid, but when you have a sick kid, why do you think you can tell me what you think I should do? So I don't know that that's exactly it, but that's one of those times when I was like looking back, we worked really hard to take really good care of Jake and to really give him this great life. And were we perfect at all times? No. But part of that was for our family to be a unit that could still do things, right? Like it wasn't going to be that, only one of, like we weren't a divide, like sometimes we were divide and conquer because we had to be. But we also tried really hard to just do things as a family.
Yeah, I feel a lot of judgment behind that scenario. That the implication is I would be 24/7 medical care for my kid if I were you.
Yeah, like I wouldn't be putting them in a situation like what. And I try to give people the benefit of the doubt because who the hell is anyone to tell people what they should do, particularly with their kids, right?
Also, I'm judging all your friends.
Yeah.
But it also sounds similar to something you said earlier on when somebody said to you, you must have known he was going to die. And I think that had to come from the fear. Yeah. If it was me, how could this come out of nowhere and I not know it? Because if that's true, then it can happen to any of us. Well, guess what? It can happen to any of us. And that's what people don't want to face.
Yep, and that's 100% it. And that was a lot of I think well-intentioned people, but it was fear.
And because we're so hung up on mortality in general.
In general.
And so you've probably had the same experience. Some people step up and some people step away.
Yeah.
It's too scary for them.
It's too scary.
And they don't want to factor it into, could it be me or could it be someone close to me? And then flipping the coin to the positive side, it can open these wonderful relationships where instead of talking about the weather today, we're talking about deep, meaningful stuff. And I never knew, like, someone is being extra kind or extra interested in Lucas or whatever, and then you find out they're having trouble with their mom's Alzheimer's or their dad's cancer or whatever. And Robin Roberts says everybody's got their something. Yep. Well, when your something is sort of out there for the world, you find out a lot more of everybody else's something.
100%.
Yeah.
And it goes back to sort of the thing I said about Jake, right? Like what he has given me is this ability to help ease other people's burden. And sometimes it's exactly what you said. It's because like our stories are so extreme and they're so whatever that it almost makes people feel better. But it also opens up this ability of these conversations. And I'm sure like when Lucas died or, when Jake died, people come out of the woodwork who've lost a child or who have had a similar experience, it made me recognize that there's so much we don't know about people, right? You know, kind of like, yes, everyone's got their something, but there's just, we don't know. Like, we only know what people let us see. I just always try to remember that. I have very much enjoyed this conversation with you.
Me too.
And I am very grateful that you agreed to be on this show. So thank you, Daniel.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.